Eh bien, ce premier jour du sommet du G20 à Rio, nous rencontrons énormément de gens intéressants en marge du sommet, et en particulier Emma Sary, qui est journaliste, mais qui travaille à Oxfam. Or, les sujets que défend Oxfam, eh bien, rencontrent les préoccupations du G20, en particulier celles de Lula. So I was saying that you work also for Oxfam, and this G20 summit is very interesting because President Lula organized for the first time social G20 in order, I think, to push a little bit the head of each state here, and also he wants to tackle the very old problem of poverty and hunger. Yeah. And I think that's one of your main fights in Oxfam. And especially you propose to do some specific taxation about the rich people, and that's what is proposing, I think. Yeah. So how you receive this Lula proposal?
Yeah, so first of all, it's fantastic that there was such a strong voice of civil society that was able to kind of input to the Leaders' Summit here in Rio. And we were really excited to hear that the South African government, who will host the G20 next year, will continue with this G20 social and with this real engagement and input from civil society, which is very important. But yeah, you're right, we're also here because President Lula has shown real leadership in these dark times around the world, with many of us facing hardship and hunger, particularly for the world's poorest people. And from the beginning, he's talked about this as a presidency to tackle inequality and to tackle hunger. And rather than this just being a rhetorical message from President Lula, we've also seen real progress. So for example, in July, we saw the finance ministers of all G20 countries agree that they would collaborate to tax the very richest people in the world. And we know that in the G20, for example, the richest 1% own 31% of the wealth. Their income is increasing, their share of the income is increasing, and taxes on them are dropping. So they've dropped.
Richer.
The rich are getting richer.
They are paying less.
The rest
taxes.
of us are struggling, and the poorest are bearing the worst of all of it. Yeah. So what we're hoping to see tomorrow in the final communique from the leaders is a recommitment to this agreement to tax the richest individuals, and also some clarity that they're going to do this in a way that has the right scale to have an impact, you know? So,
well, they're speaking here in the small books they give to everybody.
Yeah.
2%,
they have a
2% tax.
And they also have a picture of some activists, I think, saying tax the super rich. Absolutely, we agree.
It's a street tag. We show it.
Exactly. And we saw
quite clear.
Yeah. And we saw young people in the streets of Rio on Saturday marching, shouting to tax the super rich.
So they propose a tax of 2% in order to get to 250 billions per year.
And in fact, we think it should be more. So this was an illustration. This was a calculation as an illustration that Gabriel Zucman was asked to calculate to demonstrate that it is possible and feasible to raise huge amounts of money by taxing the rich. If you really want to reduce inequality, in fact, we have found that unless you have a net percentage of 8% on the super rich, it's not going to reduce inequality. The richest are still going to get richer. Yeah. And today there are 16 people in the world that if 99% of their money vanished tonight, they would still be billionaires. Yeah. You know, imagine 99% of your money disappears. They are still a billionaire, you know? Okay. And all of this, honestly though, as alongside a story of hunger.
To be clear for everybody, when you're speaking about rich people, we're not speaking about the bourgeois who has his apartment and his secondary house and his BMW. Okay, it's wealthy person, but it's not the rich we were speaking about. We're speaking the super mega rich billionaires. It's rich, very. It's not even the 1%. It's 0.1. I don't know.
We're talking about the super rich, the people who are buying super yachts, while some people can't afford to eat. That's who needs to be taxed. Yeah.
And so you think that something will come out?
Yeah, we're very hopeful, although we hear that negotiations are really going down to the wire. And it's not because there is a lack of broad agreement on this issue. Many governments are very positive. We've had endorsement from Spain, from South Africa. Obviously, Brazil is a very strong champion, but we also know that Argentina is less keen on this, and we hope that the rest of the G20 leaders will not cave into this pressure from Argentina to water down an
agreement. Apparently, Milei accepted. We heard that he accepted, but we don't know what he accepted.
Let's hope that this is true and we can all be celebrating real progress tomorrow on taxing the super rich.
But you are Oxfam, you know that the super rich, they have their way to avoid all taxes. As a matter of fact, many super rich, they just pay no tax at all because you have all this way to go to, I don't know, Cayman Island, Singapore, Dubai, change the money, you make it turn among many banks. It's not under your name, it's holdings. Plus in Europe, because we are in Europe, we have all these places. I mean, Luxembourg, Ireland, the French, British islands. How they will do that? Because I remember that after the crisis of 2008, there was a huge meeting of governments in London, and at that time they said, oh yeah, we have to tax the rich, we have to avoid all these things, but nothing was done. So
I mean, you're absolutely right. Unless this goes hand in hand with measures to close those loopholes and to end tax secrecy, then there will always be a way for the super rich to buy their way out of problems. But that's also why it needs to be a global agreement. So we can't have a situation where one country taxes really progressively and makes the rich people pay, makes the super rich pay their fair share, but they can then just shift themselves to somewhere else and avoid the problem. It needs to be a truly global deal that stops them taking advantage.
Well, England is not anymore, Great Britain is not anymore in the EU, but you know the problem, we have that problem in EU already, and to reach that goal, it means to change almost completely all the agreements that exist between European countries. Because, once again, the former president of the Euro Commission, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, when he was Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who organized this scheme of avoiding taxes within Europe. So, I mean, isn't it complicated?
Just because something's complicated doesn't mean it's not possible. And where there's enough political will, we know things can be done. So we know that in response to the COVID pandemic, how many billions of dollars, were mobilized to invest. And we know that when politicians feel the pressure, and they should be feeling the pressure because publics are angry about this, you know. Ordinary people, when they are polled in countries like Brazil, you get figures of 80% of people believe that the super rich should pay more tax, and that things like tax havens and tax secrecy should be, that it's like something from medieval times. It's not something for a modern, fair global society. So really, it's about whether leaders can be progressive enough to make this the world that we need, and if not, young people are not going to listen to them.
Sure. And by the way, the United States did something like that for their own country during Obama time. They said
did something
to pursue the super rich. They said no, you cannot hide from our US taxes. They said even to the Swiss banks, they said no, you have to give us all the names because we will do some harm to your banking system. So it's possible.
There's always a way to make these things happen when there's enough political investment. We remain optimistic because this has to happen. Leaders are also, and governments are negotiating right now in parallel to this G20 in Baku at the Conference of Parties at the COP on climate change, and talking about the huge amounts of money that are needed, not just to lift look after the poorest people and the impact of climate change, but also to make sure there is a future for humanity on this planet. And the idea that we can't afford to pay for this is frankly not acceptable. We can't afford as a global society to pay for the future of humanity, for people to be able to exist on planet Earth. Of course, that's not true.
Sure.
So hopefully, if we have a good deal here at the G20 tomorrow and it really feels like the momentum is moving that way, it will translate to a more ambitious and a more realistic climate finance target in Baku at the COP.
Okay. And also it's President Lula said, as a president of a country which is among the BRICS countries, that they want a change in the global governance in order to do things like this one. And they want a fair share for the country of the global south into the international organization like IMF, World Bank, United Nations. Do you think that we, the rich former colonial countries, we are able to share that power we still have on these institutions?
I think we should? Absolutely. Do I think governments
are? We consider the same. we are
absolutely. Important to be clear though. I think if you look at this as being a debate that President Lula has raised in fora before his G20, he's made it another centerpiece of his G20. Again, we have the South African presidency next year. We have the African Union now with a role at the G20. We have a Financing for Development conference next year where again this kind of reform of global governance and financial institutions is on the agenda. This is a story and a kind of a push that is not going away. So I really hope that that governments who hold the power now are willing to accept that there needs to be a sharing of power, just like there needs to be a fairer sharing of money in this world. That's the only way a global society is going to work for all of us.
History is knocking on the door.
I hope so, I believe so,
Okay, well, let's hope together and we'll see what will happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bonjour à tous, comme vous voyez on fait plein de rencontres lors du sommet du G20, comme vous l'avez vu avec Georges qui a pu interroger quelqu'un d'Oxfam. Et donc cette fois-ci je suis avec Sany Fuché de la radio-télévision nationale d'Angola qui justement vient couvrir cet événement et avec lequel on va échanger. Bom dia, Sany Fuché.
Bom dia, Pedro.
Então, por que é importante para Angola estar presente no G20?
É importante porque é uma plataforma de diálogo multilateral, juntando aqui os países mais desenvolvidos, mas também organizações internacionais. E Angola é um país em franca expansão, precisa efetivamente de captar parceiros e de fazer ouvir a sua voz, e ao mesmo tempo que vai colocando aquelas que são as suas preocupações e necessidades, de modo a que tenha estas questões resolvidas.
Porque na França se conhece muito mal a Angola, tem a visão ainda de um país que sai da guerra civil, e quem está mais informado sabe que é um país que está se desenvolvendo rápido com a ajuda dos chineses e de outros países, e que justamente Luanda é uma das capitais mais desenvolvidas da África, que é pouco conhecida na França. Nesse âmbito, você acha que justamente a Angola é um dos países africanos de mais potencial?
Sim, com muito potencial. Temos outros como a África do Sul e Nigéria, mas Angola tem jogado um papel muito importante, não só do ponto de vista do desenvolvimento, aposta no capital humano, tem uma grande intervenção nas questões de paz a nível do continente. No próximo ano, nosso país vai assumir a liderança da União Africana, esteve coordenando até bem pouco tempo a SADC e outros organismos de cooperação em que Angola também se destaca, então é uma voz ativa no continente africano. Agora, em África, em França, você diz bem, não é? Conhecem pouco, então acho que é uma boa oportunidade para os franceses explorarem mais Angola, porque Angola é um país interessante, tem estabilidade, tem pessoas fantásticas, lugares e recursos naturais imensos e está aí aberta para o mundo.
Se eu não me engano, a coisa que foi mais exportada agora é a dança. Como chama? É dança kuduro, não?
Kuduro, kizomba.
Exatamente, que foi um sucesso enorme, mas muito pouca gente sabe que vem da Angola. Que culturalmente a Angola justamente que é novo, porque geralmente os países africanos não exportam a sua cultura. Estar presente no G20 também faz parte de uma expansão cultural da Angola, você acha?
Sim, efetivamente, porque estando aqui, ao lado desses líderes mundiais, falando para uma plateia de milhões de habitantes, efetivamente faz passar também a sua voz, sendo que os temas que o Brasil traz para essa cimeira do G20 são temas que também fazem parte da agenda angolana. Desenvolvimento sustentável, transição energética, aposta na agricultura, são temas globais e Angola não está à margem disso.
E qual é o papel da Angola em relação aos BRICS?
Angola não é membro dos BRICS, mas mantém relações estreitas com os países membros e basicamente é isso que eu posso dizer no âmbito da cooperação.
Mas você acha que tem no caminho que segue Angola, é bem provável eles querer entrar nos BRICS ou vão querer ficar fora?
Bem, aí depende muito de quais sejam as prioridades do governo, não é? Mas do ponto de vista da cooperação, aquela que tem sido a mensagem que Angola passa é colaborar com todos os países do mundo, não há assim uma aposta em que o nosso parceiro só pode ser este e aquele, porque cada parceiro é um parceiro e Angola sabe efetivamente como lidar com as diferentes nações.
E você falou da estabilidade, justamente, em relação ao Brasil e outros países do G20, qual que é o país que mais investe hoje na Angola, fora a própria Angola?
Tivemos durante muito tempo a China, mas temos também agora uma parceria muito forte com os Estados Unidos e a União Europeia. A Rússia também é um parceiro tradicional de Angola, Portugal, Itália, Espanha. Basicamente, com a maior parte dos países do G20, Angola tem cooperação.
E vocês conseguem ter uma relação saudável com Portugal ou ainda tem atrito por causa do histórico colonial?
Não, isso não existe nenhum atrito. Essa é a minha opinião já, não é? Mas não existe nada disso, tanto que Angola e Portugal tratam-se sempre de modo institucional como países irmãos, não é? Por causa justamente desses laços que unem os dois países que vêm desde as independências.
Porque no caso da França, a França ainda tem muitos atritos com suas antigas colônias, o Mali, os Camarões, o Senegal,
não é o caso da Angola, não,
justamente.
É muito diferente.
E vocês são um país de língua portuguesa, eu suponho que por isso que o Lula também convidou, porque tem o Moçambique também, se eu não me engano, que foi convidado o G20. Para você acha que o Brasil tem um papel importante para justamente ajudar os países da África a poder ter uma voz mais ouvida?
É a visão do presidente Lula da Silva, não é? Que ele visitou nosso país o ano passado e levou justamente essa mensagem de maior cooperação entre os países do sul global. Em parte, se calhar, também está na origem, não é, do convite que foi feito a Angola. E de resto também o Brasil foi um dos primeiros países, o primeiro mesmo a reconhecer a independência da Angola, então sempre teve uma boa relação com o nosso país.
Entendi. E o que você espera concretamente desse G20? O que você acha que vai sair dessas reuniões e qual vai ser o impacto justamente sobre a vida dos cidadãos do mundo e da Angola, por exemplo?
As expectativas são muito altas, não é? Olhando tanto para aquela que foi a mensagem do presidente Lula da Silva, a comunicação do secretário-geral das Nações Unidas ontem, quando chegou, acho que há muita convergência, né, no discurso dos líderes. Agora, efetivamente, mobilizar mais recursos, porque a chave passa por aí e estão aqui as pessoas que decidem, os responsáveis pelo destino do mundo estão aqui, estão a esperar que tudo corra pelo melhor.
E você acha que justamente você falou da União Africana, Angola, tanto a Etiópia, a África do Sul e outros países do continente africano têm um papel importante para a estabilização e desenvolvimento justamente dos outros países africanos que estão mais atrasados?
Sim, Angola sobretudo joga um papel importantíssimo que já foi reconhecido por todas as lideranças, seja do Ocidente, do continente africano, da Ásia. Qualquer parceiro de Angola valoriza esse seu empenho na luta contra a estabilização do continente africano, apoiando outras nações e fazendo aí o diálogo sempre para a paz. Essa é uma marca também do nosso país, porque tivemos um longo período de guerra, então Angola procura passar a sua experiência para resolver os conflitos sempre.
Isso é importante, porque quando a gente vê o conflito em Gaza, no Sudão ou também na Ucrânia, país que tem experiência de conflito, que quer ajudar para a paz, é essencial, porque do outro lado a gente tem os Estados Unidos que só conhece guerra, que vive da guerra, se a gente pode dizer, da indústria da guerra, e os países europeus que seguem os Estados Unidos. Então, você acha que até nesses conflitos, fora os conflitos que pode ouvir na África, a Angola pode ajudar, por exemplo?
O discurso da Angola tem sido sempre pela pacificação e resolução dos conflitos pela via do diálogo. Sempre que tem a oportunidade de intervir nos foros internacionais, a Angola leva essa mensagem e tem trabalhado para isso.
Isso é muito bom. Olha, eu agradeço muito pela a conversa.
Eu agradeço também.
J'encourage effectivement nos téléspectateurs à se renseigner justement sur l'Angola, de sortir un peu des clichés et de voir justement que l'Afrique, c'est pas aussi que des pays avec des problèmes, c'est aussi des pays qui veulent avancer, qui veulent promouvoir la paix et qui veulent aussi que leur voix soit entendue dans cette réorganisation géopolitique qui est le monde actuel.
Obrigada.
Bonsoir à tous, il est très tard en France, on a 4 heures de décalage et nous finissons ici cette première journée du G20. Je suis avec monsieur le docteur, professeur John James Curtin, qui travaille à l'université de University of Toronto, à l'université de Toronto et qui est en charge des recherches sur le G20. So, I make a small introduction for our French auditory and Doctor, what's going on today? Is there any achievement on this first day of this fantastic G20?
Oh yes, indeed. The Rio summit is on track to produce a substantial performance, above all on its two first big priorities of equality in the economic and social domain, and its second on ecological sustainability with climate change and climate finance and renewable energy at the core. On the first one, where President Lula's greatest achievement was to get commitments to end hunger in the world by 2030 and to reduce poverty.
So that's the Global Alliance, the first talk this morning.
They got off, to a very swift start a few days ago with announcements of $35 billion. And here during the morning, the countries chipped in their money. So a promise of a big contribution from China, several other rich developing countries, many of whom had been invited here as guests. So these summits are great global fundraisers, and it seems to be working well as far as hunger and poverty is concerned so far.
So you would say that it's a great day, even though that yesterday everybody was a little bit afraid that the G20 will be overshadowed by the announcement of the authorization to fire rocket inside Russia, and everybody was speaking about war, and Mr. Lula doesn't want to have a G20 who is overshadowed by war. He wants to speak about poverty, hunger, inequalities, and access for the global south to institutions in which do not have access.
Yes.
Well, not enough, at least.
Well, I think the greatest missile our friends in the United States sent into Rio came in the person of President Milei of Argentina, who went and saw Donald Trump and then came here and started reversing Argentina's positions on many of the important issues, progressive taxation of the rich, gender equality, and climate change. But we've just learned that on the issue of climate finance, President Lula now has an agreement on a text that says that developing countries, if they're rich, must also provide climate finance to poor developing countries. So that
Sure
means
investment.
China, it means Saudi Arabia, and others. So a recognition that we're all in this together. It's not north versus south, it's all of us. Tout ensemble.
Clearly, President Lula requested for the global south a better world governance.
Yeah.
And to have the saying, not only the saying, but a better share in United Nations, in Security Council, in the IMF, in the World Bank. Do you think that the G7 countries that are more in control of this world institution will give some more place to countries like Brazil, India, South Africa?
No. And I think that President Lula's third great priority will be a priority for the next host of the summit. And it's not just the G7. If we go to the core of the United Nations, the Security Council, the Permanent Five, China has a veto and it doesn't want to dilute it, all right? Russia has a veto, and is it in the global south or north or somewhere? But it's not going to give up its veto. So all the leaders here, north or south or in between, agree that we do need to reform the pillar institutions we created way back in 1944, 1945, but they can't agree on how to do it. And not one of them knows or has even said they want to reform it in the most profound way. The UN, the IMF, the World Bank, their charters, their constitutions don't recognize even the existence, let alone the value, of the natural environment. And even though they've been revised since 1944, 45, still the same old thing. So if we want to reform them, that's where I'd start, but that is, I think, a challenge for another summit another
Maybe next
time.
year in South Africa, yeah?
I think we might have to wait.
It's the hard thing, yeah?
Oh,
It's
yes.
the most difficult.
Yeah. I mean, you can have an environment without an economy, but you can't have
No,
an economy without an environment. So we all depend.
Completely absurd.
The air we breathe, yeah. So I think we need some of the G7 leaders who really care about climate change. And that includes President Macron of France.
Sure.
And some of the other progressive issues, gender equality. Trudeau of Canada, Macron of France, all right? And so they're at one with Lula on moving that ahead. So I think we'll see some progress there too.
I'm asking you this question because I see that you have edited a book on, on this G20 summit. You can tell us more about it. And I see that you have the third, this here is the future of multilateralism. So you are tackling these questions. So what is this book about?
We produced this background book and have for every G20 summit since the start in 2008. If the G20 had a secretariat of its own, and it doesn't and shouldn't, they'd produce this basic information for all the media, all the delegations, all the stakeholders. So we do it as a global public good, and we start with all of the leaders outlining their positions, their hopes, starting with President Lula lui-même, himself.
That's great.
And of course, we do have
All the countries, representatives.
oh yes, and yes, we will find President Macron in here. Voila.
This is the picture when he was just elected 7 years ago. It's the official picture of the president.
He would want to still look young.
Yeah.
And
We know
maybe
that.
if he gets enough backing for his big priorities here, he'll actually feel young again.
Yeah.
But when he returns home and looks at the public opinion polls, well, ça
We'll
va.
see. Ça va. So we have access to the book through the QR code, yeah?
Yes, everyone in
Online.
the world who cares
So we'll put
can
it if you
download
agree,
it.
so
Absolutely.
people
yeah.
can read it. I think it's
That's
very interesting,
right.
yeah, and they will understand more about this G20.
Yeah. And next year, maybe I can finally convince my publisher in the United Kingdom, as a good Canadian, to actually have some of the articles in French as well.
It will be great. It was the language of diplomacy in the past. Okay, Dr. Curtin, thank you very much. It was very nice, and
Okay, merci.
thank you for your good work.
Good.